The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone thought they knew everyone else. Trees lined the streets, their leaves swaying gently in the soft evening breeze, and kids played in the yards, their laughter echoing between houses. It was the kind of place where doors were rarely locked and people waved at each other when walking down the sidewalk. Families had lived there for years, and even newcomers were quickly welcomed, though some were more private than others. Among them was a man who had lived in the area for decades. He kept to himself most of the time, but was friendly enough to exchange nods and small talk with neighbors. Life seemed ordinary, even comforting. People went about their daily routines, unaware of the small changes that were slowly creeping into the community. It started with subtle signs. Flyers about new rules were posted on trees or slipped under doors, warning residents about fines for minor infractions, mowing the lawn late, leaving garbage bins out, or even parking in certain areas. At first, people thought it was just the homeowners association being overly strict, the usual kind of bureaucratic annoyance that came with suburban life. But soon, the notices became more intimidating. The language changed. It was no longer polite reminders but sharp warnings, filled with legal jargon and threats of enforcement. The neighbor noticed these changes, but didn't think much of it. He had seen bureaucracy in his life and had learned to handle it with patience. Yet there was something about the tone of these notices that didn't feel right. It wasn't just the words. It was the feeling behind them. The messages seemed personal, as if someone was watching and judging every action. The neighbor mentioned it to a few others, hoping for reassurance, but most brushed it off. People had grown used to a little unnecessary drama from the association, and they weren't inclined to think it could turn dangerous. One afternoon, while trimming the hedges in his front yard, he noticed a car slowly driving past. It was an unmarked vehicle, plain but unusual for the area. The driver lingered, staring at houses with more attention than any casual passerby would. The neighbor felt a flicker of unease but shrugged it off. Perhaps it was just someone lost, he thought. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave him, a quiet sense of being watched that made him pause more than once as he worked. A few days later, two men appeared at his door. They were dressed in plain clothes but carried themselves with a confidence and authority that made them seem official. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Homeowners Association, explaining that they were there to enforce certain rules and inspect compliance. The neighbor, still thinking this was routine, invited them to speak. The men began asking questions, their tone polite but firm. They asked about recent landscaping, driveway maintenance, and even details about his visitors. It seemed excessive, but he answered calmly, hoping to satisfy their inquiries and get them to leave. After the visit, the neighbor felt a growing sense of unease. There was something about the men that didn't add up. Their questions were too specific, their manner too forceful for ordinary HOA representatives. He shared his concerns with a friend who suggested not overreacting. "Maybe they're just thorough," the friend said. But still, the neighbor couldn't shake the feeling that these men weren't who they claimed to be. That evening, while sitting on his porch and sipping a cup of tea, he noticed the same unmarked car parked across the street. The men were inside, their faces partially hidden, seemingly watching his house. A chill ran down his spine. He felt trapped, as if a shadow had fallen over the familiar, safe streets he had known for years. The ordinary world he trusted suddenly felt unpredictable and threatening. It was then that the retired Navy SEAL came into the story. He was a man of few words, preferring action over conversation. He had moved to the neighborhood seeking peace, valuing the quiet life after years of intense service. His presence was almost unnoticed, blending into the background as he tended to his property or went for long walks. Yet his instincts remained sharp. He had an eye for detail, a sense of awareness honed by years of training. When he noticed the neighbor looking uneasy and glancing toward the parked car, he felt that familiar spark of concern. Something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood increased. More notices appeared, each more aggressive than the last. Residents began to whisper among themselves, speculating about enforcement and the legitimacy of the association's new representatives. Fear began to spread quietly, but the neighbor's fear was personal and pressing. He felt watched at every turn, and every unexpected knock on the door made his heart race. The unmarked car became a constant presence, parked strategically where it could see most of the street without being too obvious. The neighbor tried to maintain normalcy, going about his chores, speaking to others casually, but inside he was on edge. Sleep became restless. He imagined scenarios that he didn't want to confront, scenarios where the men might come to his door and escalate matters. Every sound in the night, the crunch of gravel, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, made him alert. He wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but the situation was steadily eroding his sense of safety. Meanwhile, the retired Navy SEAL watched silently from a distance. He observed the comings and goings of the unmarked car, the unusual interactions and the subtle fear that seemed to grip the neighbor. He had a sense of responsibility, not just for the neighbor, but for the community. Experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that this was more than a simple bureaucratic inconvenience. Something dangerous was developing, and he needed to be ready. One evening, the neighbor decided to confront the situation directly. He stepped outside, intending to ask the men why they were lingering and what authority they truly had. As he approached, the car's engine was off and the men were seated inside, observing quietly. The neighbor's voice was steady, but his pulse quickened. He tried to assert calm authority, asking if they were official and requesting identification. The men smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. There was a coldness behind it, a subtle intimidation. The neighbor felt the first real wave of fear, a recognition that he was dealing with people who had no regard for rules or honesty. At that moment, the Navy SEAL stepped onto the neighbor's porch. He didn't say much, just positioned himself so the men could see he was there. His presence was immediate and commanding, though quiet. The men in the car hesitated, their casual confidence faltering slightly. They had not expected someone who could read a situation so clearly, someone who projected authority without words. The tension hung in the air, heavy and palpable. The neighbor realized then that he was not alone. Relief mixed with continued worry, knowing that while immediate danger was not yet here, it could escalate at any moment. The SEAL didn't offer reassurances with words. His vigilance and calm presence said enough. The neighbor took a deep breath, steadying himself, and returned to his porch, keeping an eye on the car. That night, the unmarked car left, but the feeling of being watched did not. The neighborhood seemed quieter, almost holding its breath. The neighbor and the SEAL exchanged nods across the fence, a silent understanding passing between them. It was clear that the situation was far from over, that something was brewing just beneath the surface of ordinary suburban life. The SEAL remained alert, and the neighbor understood that the coming days would require caution, courage, and awareness. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun set and the streetlights flickered on, the ordinary world of the neighborhood seemed fragile. The peaceful rhythms of life were disrupted by unseen forces and deceptive appearances. The neighbor reflected on how quickly things could change, how the sense of safety he had taken for granted could be challenged without warning, and in that reflection, he found a small measure of gratitude for the presence of someone who could act decisively, someone whose life had prepared him to see danger before it arrived. The first part of the story ended not with resolution, but with awareness, tension, and the understanding that the ordinary can be shattered at any moment, and that sometimes heroes walk quietly among us, ready to step forward when the time comes. Days passed, and the tension in the neighborhood grew quietly, like a storm building on the horizon. The neighbor tried to return to normal life, but every sound outside made him pause. The mailbox rattled, and he would glance nervously at the street. The unmarked car seemed to appear at random, sometimes parked just down the road, other times hidden behind trees where its occupants could watch without being obvious. Each time his unease deepened, and he began to notice more strange behaviors around the neighborhood. Small details, which he had ignored before, now felt threatening. A door left slightly open at a neighbor's house. A stranger walking slowly past with no clear purpose. A flyer that had not been there the day before. It all built a feeling that something larger was at work. The two men posing as HOA representatives began to escalate their tactics. They started visiting houses more frequently, knocking at doors and questioning residents about compliance with obscure rules. Their demeanor was polite on the surface, but there was an underlying tension, a sense of pressure that made people uneasy. Some neighbors chose to ignore them, hoping they would go away, while others tried to comply, worrying that refusing could lead to trouble. The neighbor was somewhere in between. He did not trust these men, but wanted to avoid unnecessary conflict, hoping that by remaining calm and cautious he could stay safe. One afternoon, the neighbor was tending to his garden when the two men approached him again. This time their questions were more pointed. They asked about security cameras, about who came and went from his home, and even about his schedule. The neighbor answered cautiously, trying not to give too much information. Something about their tone made him stiffen. It was no longer simply annoying, it felt like intimidation. He remembered the unmarked car parked across the street, the way the men had watched silently from inside, and a creeping realization settled in. They were not ordinary HOA enforcers. The rules they claimed to uphold seemed secondary to a more personal agenda. The retired Navy SEAL, living quietly nearby, noticed the change in the neighbor's demeanor. He had seen this kind of behavior before, and his instincts told him to pay attention. The SEAL was aware of the men's presence even when the neighbor was not. He watched their movements, their interactions, and the subtle ways they tried to exert control over the street. His experience allowed him to see patterns that others missed. He noticed the way they parked, always in positions that allowed them to observe without drawing attention. He noticed the way they approached doors, calm but deliberate, as if testing the response before making a move. He knew it was only a matter of time before an actual confrontation occurred. The neighbor began documenting the events. He took notes on visits, times of day, what was asked, and any unusual behavior. This process, while helpful in giving him a sense of control, did little to ease the anxiety. He felt watched even when alone, and ordinary tasks like checking the mail or walking to the car became exercises in alertness. His mind raced with questions. Were these men allowed to be there? What was their real purpose? Were they waiting for a specific moment to act? One evening, as the neighbor was returning from the store, he noticed the unmarked car parked unusually close to his driveway. The men were sitting inside, seemingly waiting. Panic started to rise, but he forced himself to remain calm. He walked briskly inside, locking the doors behind him. From a distance, the Navy SEAL observed, noting every detail. He understood the importance of timing, of knowing when and how to intervene if necessary. He also knew that confrontation, while inevitable, needed to be controlled and strategic. There was no room for mistakes. The following day, the men escalated further. They came to the neighbor's door without warning, claiming they needed to inspect certain areas of the property immediately. The neighbor, sensing danger, refused entry. The men grew insistent, their polite tone giving way to subtle threats. It was clear they were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before resistance. The neighbor felt a surge of fear, but also a determination not to let them intimidate him. He knew he needed help, but also understood that outside authorities might not recognize the seriousness of the threat. During this tense period, the SEAL stepped in more actively, without yet confronting the imposters directly. He began observing their patterns more closely, taking mental notes of their schedules, the way they interacted with others, and the tactics they used to create fear. He prepared for intervention, making sure he could act quickly if the situation escalated. At the same time, he maintained a calm presence near the neighbor, ensuring that the neighbor felt a measure of safety and support. The SEAL's quiet vigilance was a reassurance, though he offered no words beyond what was necessary. His presence alone was enough to communicate preparedness and authority. The neighbor also began reaching out to a few trusted residents, sharing his concerns carefully. Some were skeptical, dismissing the incidents as misunderstandings, but others acknowledged that the behavior seemed unusual and threatening. They began looking out for one another, creating a small network of vigilance. It was not formal, but it was enough to reduce the feeling of isolation that the neighbor had experienced. Still, the fear of the men returning with greater force weighed heavily. The ordinary routines of life, working, gardening, shopping, were now shadowed by the possibility of confrontation. As the days wore on, the tension became almost tangible. The imposters were increasingly bold, appearing at unexpected times and in places that suggested they were monitoring the neighbor's comings and goings. The neighbor became hyper-aware of his surroundings, noticing every unfamiliar face, every car that lingered too long. The sense of intrusion of being watched grew heavier, and the SEAL continued his silent observation, prepared to act the moment the situation crossed the line from intimidation to violence. One afternoon, the imposters attempted to corner the neighbor in his own driveway. They blocked his path and demanded to inspect his property immediately, claiming legal authority. The neighbor, heart-pounding, refused and attempted to de-escalate the situation verbally, hoping to buy time and avoid physical conflict. The imposters pressed harder, their polite tone replaced by veiled threats. It was the first clear moment when the neighbor realized that their intentions were not simply about rules or compliance. It was about exerting control, instilling fear, and testing how far he could be pushed. The SEAL, watching from a discreet distance, assessed the situation quickly. He noted the positions of the imposters, their body language, and their readiness to escalate. He moved closer, positioning himself in a way that would allow him to intervene without unnecessary confrontation. The moment required calm, precision, and control, all qualities the SEAL had honed over years of service. He understood the importance of presence. Sometimes the mere appearance of readiness could prevent violence. The neighbor noticed the SEAL approaching and felt a wave of relief. The fear did not vanish, but the presence of someone capable and alert restored a sense of balance. The imposters paused, sensing that the dynamic had shifted. The neighbor took a deep breath and held his ground, understanding that the SEAL's intervention did not eliminate the threat entirely, but changed the parameters of the encounter. By evening, the imposters had left, but the neighbor knew this was temporary. The tension would return and he needed to remain vigilant. The SEAL remained nearby, silently reinforcing the sense of protection. The neighborhood seemed quieter as the day ended, but the undercurrent of unease persisted. The ordinary peace of the streets was gone, replaced by the awareness that deception and intimidation could lurk anywhere, even in familiar surroundings. The neighbor reflected on the events, realizing that courage, awareness, and strategic support were essential to navigating the dangerous and unpredictable challenges that had entered their lives. The days ahead promised further tests, but he was no longer alone in facing them, and that knowledge provided a fragile but vital comfort. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a peak that could not be ignored. The imposters, posing as HOA enforcers, grew bolder each day, no longer limiting themselves to polite questioning and veiled threats. They had begun to appear at unexpected times, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone, always observing and testing boundaries. The neighbor's sense of safety had been slowly eroded, replaced by constant vigilance. Every knock at the door, every car slowly driving past, every unfamiliar face became a cause for alarm. It was no longer a matter of annoyance. It was fear creeping into the ordinary rhythm of daily life. One morning, as the neighbor stepped outside to take out the trash, he noticed the familiar unmarked car parked nearby. This time, the men were not subtle. They stood outside the vehicle, casually leaning against it, but their eyes locked on him as he walked across the driveway. His pulse quickened, and he realized that the confrontation he had feared for so long might be imminent. He had tried to maintain composure, but the sight of them there, so deliberately watching, stirred a deep instinctive response. Something inside him urged caution, yet also a readiness to protect himself and his home. Over the next few hours, the men made several attempts to corner him. Approaching with questions, instructions, and subtle intimidation, they claimed authority, citing vague regulations and fines, but their words were inconsistent, their attitude aggressive, and their aim clear. The neighbor understood that this was not about rules or compliance anymore. It was about power, about fear, and about pushing him to react. He felt trapped, as if the boundaries of his own home had been violated by their presence. Simple activities like taking out the garbage or checking the mailbox had turned into exercises in alertness and self-control. The retired Navy SEAL, living quietly nearby, observed these events with sharp focus. His instincts, honed over years of service, told him that the imposters were preparing for something more aggressive. He had watched patterns emerge, times of day when the men were most likely to appear, their subtle signals to one another, and the way they tried to isolate the neighbor from the rest of the community. Each observation informed his strategy, each action planned in advance in case direct intervention became necessary. He knew that when the moment came, hesitation could be dangerous. The neighbor began taking precautions. Doors were double-locked, windows were checked, and security cameras were activated. He also tried to maintain a calm demeanor, refusing to show fear, though his heart raced at the thought of the imposters attempting to enter his property. Every sound outside, a creak, a distant footstep, the rustle of leaves, was amplified in his mind. The sense of being watched was constant, a shadow that followed him through every room, every corridor, every hallway. One afternoon, the imposters escalated further. They arrived in a pair, approaching the driveway with a deliberate pace that suggested confidence and authority. Their intent was clear. They wanted to intimidate, and they wanted to see if the neighbor would resist. The neighbor standing near the front door realized that verbal defiance alone might not be enough. He felt a surge of anxiety, but also a sense of determination. He was not going to be bullied out of his home, not by strangers pretending to enforce rules. The seal moved closer, maintaining a discreet but strategic distance. His presence was subtle yet powerful, a silent assurance that the neighbor was not alone. He evaluated the impostor's body language, their positioning, and the likely sequence of their actions. He understood that timing and calm decisiveness were essential. The goal was to prevent harm, to diffuse aggression before it turned violent. The SEAL's experience allowed him to predict movements, anticipate threats, and position himself in a way that maximized control over the situation without escalating it unnecessarily. The imposters began circling, trying to create pressure from different angles. They made direct demands, insisting on inspection of the property and questioning the neighbor about security measures, visitors, and daily routines. The neighbor answered carefully, keeping his voice calm, though inside adrenaline coursed through his veins. He felt a mix of fear, anger, and resolve. The intrusions had pushed him to a point where complacency was no longer an option. He understood the seriousness of the situation and recognized the need for both caution and readiness. As the confrontation continued, the SEAL's presence became more obvious. He stepped onto the porch, maintaining a calm and authoritative stance. The imposters noticed him immediately, their posture stiffening. They had not anticipated a third party who could read the situation and respond with confidence. The tension thickened, the air heavy with anticipation. The neighbor, seeing the SEAL, felt a surge of relief. The fear remained, but it was tempered by the knowledge that someone capable and experienced was prepared to act. The imposters attempted a final maneuver, trying to block the neighbor's path and pressure him into submission. Their approach was aggressive, testing both physical and mental boundaries. The neighbor stood firm, refusing to yield, while the SEAL assessed the situation, ready to intervene if necessary. The imposters paused, recognizing that the balance of power had shifted. They were not used to resistance, especially resistance backed by skill and authority. The moment was tense, each second stretching longer than the last as the outcome remained uncertain. After several minutes, the imposters retreated, their attempts at intimidation unsuccessful. They left in their unmarked car, but the tension lingered, a reminder that the threat had not disappeared entirely. The neighbor felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief, knowing that the immediate danger had been prevented but that vigilance was still required. The SEAL remained nearby, silently monitoring the street and surrounding areas, ready to respond to any further escalation. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the neighbor began to understand the importance of preparation and awareness. He realized that the ordinary routines of life could be disrupted by individuals with malicious intent, and that readiness and calm decisiveness could make the difference between harm and safety. He reflected on the courage required not only to face immediate danger, but also to maintain composure under stress, to assess threats accurately, and to act with careful judgment. The SEAL, though quietly humble, had played a crucial role in preventing harm. His presence had changed the dynamics of the encounter, demonstrating that experience, vigilance, and strategic thinking could neutralize potential threats without unnecessary confrontation. The neighbor felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the immediate intervention but also for the reassurance that someone capable and aware was nearby. The ordinary peace of the neighborhood had been challenged, but the courage and readiness displayed had preserved safety for the time being. That evening, the neighborhood seemed calm. Yet the events of the day left a lingering awareness of vulnerability. Conversations between neighbors became more cautious, and the sense of community vigilance subtly increased. The neighbor took comfort in knowing that the seal remained a quiet guardian, someone who understood the risks and had the ability to respond effectively. The ordinary rhythms of life were slowly restored, but with a heightened sense of awareness and preparedness. The days following the confrontation were marked by careful observation and strategic adjustments. The neighbor continued to monitor the street, document unusual occurrences, and maintain a cautious approach to interactions with the imposters. The seal remained discreet but attentive, ready to act if necessary. The experience had strengthened the neighbor's resilience, teaching him the importance of composure, awareness, and the value of having experienced allies in the face of unpredictable threats. Life in the neighborhood was no longer as simple as it had been. The ordinary routines carried an undercurrent of vigilance, a recognition that danger could arise in familiar settings. Yet the confrontation had also revealed the potential for courage, resourcefulness, and protection. The neighbor understood that while fear could be managed, readiness and strategic thinking were essential to preserving safety. The SEAL's intervention had not only prevented immediate harm, but had also demonstrated the power of preparedness, calm authority, and decisive action in the face of uncertainty. The third part of the story closed with a mixture of tension and cautious relief. The imposters had retreated, but the awareness of potential danger remained. The neighborhood had learned quietly and without fanfare that ordinary life could be disrupted by deception and aggression, and that courage, vigilance, and strategic intervention could preserve safety. The neighbor, strengthened by experience and reassured by the presence of a capable protector, faced the days ahead with a new understanding of both the fragility and resilience of ordinary life. The day began quietly, but the sense of tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The imposters had grown more daring, appearing at odd hours, sometimes alone, sometimes together, their presence a constant reminder that the threat had not disappeared. The neighbor moved carefully, aware that each step outside his home was being watched. Even the simple act of opening the mailbox was approached with caution. Fear and uncertainty had become part of the daily rhythm, shadowing ordinary life. Yet the neighbor felt a growing resolve. He had experienced intimidation, had faced persistent threats, and was learning to trust both his instincts and the quiet support of the retired Navy SEAL living nearby. That morning, the imposters arrived once more unannounced. They stood at the edge of the driveway, their stance deliberate, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Their goal was clear: to provoke, to intimidate, and to force the neighbor into submission. This time they attempted a direct approach. One stepped closer, demanding access to the property while speaking with a tone that was calm but carried an unmistakable threat. The neighbor felt the surge of fear he had been preparing for, yet he also felt a steely determination. He would not give in, not now, not ever. The neighbor's heart pounded as he reached for the phone, intending to call the authorities. But he knew that police response could be delayed, and he also understood that these imposters had been skilled at exploiting gaps in oversight. He needed immediate support. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the familiar figure of the Navy SEAL moving deliberately, positioning himself in a way that maximized visibility and control over the space. The SEAL's calm presence exuded authority, a silent signal that any aggressive move would be met with instant and decisive response. The imposters did not immediately recognize the shift in dynamics. They pressed their demands, attempting to use intimidation to force compliance. The neighbor stood his ground, speaking clearly, and firmly refusing entry while keeping his tone non-provocative. The SEAL's approach was methodical. He assessed the imposters' positions, their potential to escalate, and the safest way to prevent harm. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and controlled. His body language communicated readiness without unnecessary aggression, an unspoken warning that made the imposters hesitate. One of the imposters made a sudden move, stepping closer, testing the neighbor's resolve. The SEAL reacted instantly, placing himself between the neighbor and the threat. His stance was confident and unyielding, signaling that any further aggression would be countered immediately. The imposters paused, their casual confidence shaken, They had underestimated the presence of someone capable of reading the situation, anticipating their moves and responding with controlled authority. The tension in the air was thick, every second stretching longer as both sides assessed the unfolding confrontation. The SEAL spoke calmly but firmly, his voice carrying authority without raising alarm. He instructed the imposters to leave the property immediately. His words were measured, precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The imposters, realizing they were no longer in control, hesitated. Their body language showed uncertainty, a clear departure from their previous assertiveness. The neighbor, standing behind the SEAL, felt a mixture of relief and cautious awareness. The immediate threat was being contained, but the situation was far from resolved. As the imposters began to retreat toward their unmarked vehicle, the SEAL maintained his position, ensuring that they could not circle back or attempt another maneuver. His movements were calculated to control the environment and prevent escalation. The neighbor watched in awe as someone could exert such influence through presence, readiness, and quiet authority. The imposters climbed into the car and drove away slowly, their confidence replaced by cautious awareness of the consequences of their actions. After the imposters had left, the neighbor and the SEAL surveyed the area, checking for any signs that the men might attempt to return. The SEAL's attention to detail was meticulous. He examined potential vantage points, escape routes, and the neighborhood layout, making mental notes for any future encounters. The neighbor realized that this vigilance was what had prevented the situation from turning violent. The SEAL's training and experience had transformed what could have been a dangerous confrontation into a controlled and non-lethal resolution. The neighbor thanked the SEAL, but the response was minimal. The SEAL did not seek recognition or gratitude. His satisfaction came from the prevention of harm and the quiet restoration of safety. The neighbor reflected on the value of preparedness and the importance of having someone capable nearby. Ordinary citizens could face unexpected dangers, but the presence of experience and calm authority could change outcomes dramatically. The SEAL had acted decisively, not with force for its own sake, but with strategy, awareness, and measured control. In the hours that followed, the neighbor took steps to reinforce security. Doors were checked and double-locked, windows were monitored, and cameras were adjusted for maximum coverage. He also spoke quietly with trusted neighbors, sharing observations without inciting panic. The community began to take notice, understanding that the presence of deception and intimidation could be neutralized through awareness, preparation, and calm intervention. The ordinary peace of the streets began to return, but the lessons of vigilance and readiness lingered. As evening fell, the neighborhood seemed to breathe again, a temporary calm after the storm of intimidation. The imposters had not returned, and their retreat marked a victory of strategy over aggression, preparedness over threat. The neighbor felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He had faced fear directly, relied on his instincts, and benefited from the presence of someone whose experience allowed for confident action. The ordinary life he had known was no longer entirely untouched, but he now understood that courage and vigilance could preserve safety, even in the face of deceptive and threatening forces. The SEAL remained discreetly nearby, his watchful presence a reassurance that the neighborhood was not unprotected. The imposters' retreat had been immediate, but the potential for future attempts remained a reality. The neighbor reflected on the importance of ongoing awareness and the subtle ways in which ordinary life could be disrupted. He realized that protection did not always come from outside authorities, but sometimes from quiet, capable individuals within the community. The SEAL had exemplified this principle, acting decisively and without seeking attention or acclaim. That night, the neighbor prepared for rest, though sleep came slowly. The events of the day had shifted his understanding of safety and community. Ordinary routines, checking the mail, walking to the car, or tending the garden, were no longer purely mundane tasks. They carried a layer of awareness and readiness, yet there was also comfort in knowing that preparedness and strategic action could neutralize threats effectively. The SEAL's intervention had not only prevented immediate harm, but it also provided a model of calm, deliberate response in a potentially dangerous situation. The following days continued with heightened vigilance. The neighbor maintained careful observation of the street, noting any unfamiliar vehicles or individuals. The SEAL remained a quiet but authoritative presence, ready to intervene if necessary. The community slowly adjusted, understanding that ordinary life could be preserved through awareness, preparation, and calm, but decisive action. The imposters had been temporarily neutralized, but the lessons of courage, vigilance, and strategic intervention were lasting. The fourth part of the story closed with a sense of cautious relief. Immediate danger had been prevented, thanks to the presence and actions of the retired Navy SEAL. The imposters had retreated. The neighbor's home was secure, and the neighborhood could begin to reclaim a sense of ordinary life. Yet the awareness of vulnerability remained, a reminder that preparation, courage, and the presence of capable individuals were essential to maintaining safety. The balance between ordinary life and vigilance had been restored, but the experience left a lasting mark, shaping how the neighbor and the community approached their everyday lives. The days after the confrontation were quiet, but filled with a lingering sense of awareness. The imposters had not returned, at least not immediately, and the neighborhood slowly began to feel safer. Ordinary activities resumed, but the experience had left a lasting impression on everyone involved. The neighbor continued his daily routines with a new understanding of the importance of vigilance. Each action, whether taking out the trash, walking the dog, or checking the mail, carried with it a subtle awareness of potential threats. Fear had not disappeared entirely, but it had been tempered by experience, preparation, and the knowledge that capable allies were nearby. The retired Navy SEAL remained a quiet presence, observing the streets and the people around him without intrusion. He did not seek recognition or praise, but his vigilance had provided reassurance to the neighbor and to the small circle of residents who had been aware of the unfolding situation. Over time, the neighbor came to understand the depth of the SEAL's skill, not just in physical readiness but in strategic thinking, calm decision-making, and the ability to prevent danger before it escalated. The lessons learned from his presence were invaluable, shaping how the neighbor approached challenges, threats, and even ordinary uncertainties. Authorities were eventually notified formally about the imposters. Investigations revealed that they were fraudsters, operating under false pretenses and attempting to exploit the community. Their motives were a mixture of intimidation and financial gain, preying on the vulnerability of ordinary citizens. The neighbor cooperated with the investigation, providing detailed notes and observations that documented the imposters' behavior, their methods, and the timeline of events. His careful record-keeping became a critical part of the case, helping law enforcement understand the extent of the threat and take appropriate action. As the legal process moved forward, the neighbor and the community felt a renewed sense of security. The imposters were removed from the neighborhood, and measures were put in place to prevent similar incidents in the future. Residents began to share knowledge, reinforcing the importance of vigilance, communication, and careful observation. Ordinary life began to return to its familiar rhythms, but with a heightened awareness that safety was not to be taken for granted. The experience had transformed the community, making residents more connected and attentive while also teaching them the value of calm, strategic response to potential danger. The neighbor reflected often on the events and on the quiet heroism of the retired Navy SEAL. The SEAL's actions had been decisive, but understated, a reminder that courage does not always seek attention or reward. His ability to assess a situation, anticipate threats, and act with precision had prevented what could have been a dangerous or even violent encounter. The neighbor understood that ordinary citizens could face extraordinary challenges, and that preparation, awareness, and the presence of capable individuals could make all the difference in navigating those challenges safely. Over the weeks, the neighbor continued to build his own sense of preparedness. He strengthened security measures at home, established lines of